I used to live in Parsonfield, Maine, in a secluded house surrounded by nature, far from any nearby roads or neighborhoods. Ever since I moved there, I had a deep love for fishing in the small, hidden lake just a short walk from my home. It was a peaceful spot, perfect for relaxing and escaping the hustle of the city. I always left my kayak at the same spot, propped against a large tree whenever I wasn't using it. It was easier to leave it there than carry it back and forth across the house. Overall, the lake felt like my sanctuary, a place where I would always be alone, away from any distractions or strange presences. I never imagined that something like this could ever happen. It was a warm summer night, and I had been at the lake for about an hour. The sun was fading slowly, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple while the silence of the night began to settle. I had already caught a few trout and left them in the fridge at home. The atmosphere was as calm and serene as always. When I looked over at the lake, I noticed something unusual. A few meters from the shore, someone was standing there, dumping barrels or some kind of containers into the water. The sound of the objects clashing and the dark liquid spilling into the lake broke the silence. The dark, almost black liquid that flowed into the water felt out of place, something that didn't make any sense. Alarmed, I approached the edge of the lake and shouted, trying to get the person's attention. They glanced at me briefly before sprinting off into the forest, still carrying the empty barrels. My stomach twisted as I watched the dark liquid mixing with the water. Even though I wasn't sure exactly what was happening, something felt undeniably wrong. The unease grew inside me and I knew I had to leave. Fishing had always been my escape, a place where I felt safe and far from any threats. But now that feeling of tranquility had turned oppressive. I decided to report the incident to the Department of Environmental Protection. Someone was definitely polluting the lake and I couldn't just ignore it. As I paddled back to where I had left my kayak, my body remained tense as though something else was about to happen. When I finally reached my kayak, I hurriedly packed my gear. My heart was still racing, and the feeling of discomfort lingered. While covering the kayak and placing it back on the ground, I heard a snap, like something breaking or stepping on something not far from me. I quickly turned, trying to spot the source of the noise, but the darkness made it hard to see clearly. I stood still, listening, hoping it was just the sounds of nature. Shaking hands, I finished covering the kayak faster than ever and started walking toward the road that would take me home. It was just a few minutes away, but every step felt like an eternity. I kept glancing over my shoulder, the sensation of being followed growing stronger. The forest seemed darker and quieter than ever, and fear settled deeper with each breath. By the time I reached the road and got closer to my house, every beat of my heart echoed in the quiet night. The lights were on, my car was parked in the garage, but I felt like someone knew I was there, watching me, even with all the windows closed and the curtains drawn. A chill ran down my spine with each step toward the door. As soon as I stepped inside, I locked the door behind me with a speed I had never felt before. I didn't even bother checking the windows or locking them. The fear had already taken hold of every corner of the house. I put my gear in the shed and sat inside, trying to calm my nerves. But the tension didn't let up. The weight of feeling followed, of not knowing what was coming next, was unbearable. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, the sound of the knock on the front door made my blood run cold. The fear from the lake returned in an instant. Who else would be knocking on my door this late at night? The lights were on, my car was in the garage. That knock confirmed all my suspicions. I was being followed, and there was no doubt about it. I heard the knocking again, and the sound of the microwave beeping in the kitchen seemed to amplify the fear within me. Each knock on the door became more persistent, more threatening. My heart pounded and adrenaline surged through my veins. I stood frozen, trying to gather the courage to peek through the peephole. The last thing I wanted was to confront that stranger, when the knocking was followed by a man's voice saying, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I just want to explain." A knot formed in my throat. I knew I couldn't open the door. Even though I wanted answers, something deep inside told me it wasn't safe. He was too close, as if he knew exactly what I was thinking. I shouted from the living room as firmly as I could, "Go away! I'm calling the police." but his calm reply only made me more anxious. "Sir, if you could just open the door, I'll explain everything." That sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to risk opening the door. The fear and sense of threat felt too real. Again I shouted, repeating my threat, but he didn't respond. He stepped away, the sound of his retreat fading into the night. I stayed motionless, listening to the footsteps grow quieter. I locked all the windows and doors with the urgency of reflex. The air conditioner hummed softly, but the house felt colder than ever. I could still hear the knocking echoing in my head. Even after calling the police, the silence outside was deafening. My mind kept tormenting me with questions. Who was that man? Why was he there? Why would he follow me home and invade my privacy? Those questions haunted me as I sat on the couch, tense, staring at every shadow in the house. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke to a loud noise from downstairs. My breath quickened and I sat up, straining to listen. The sound seemed to come from the living room or kitchen. I moved quietly, grabbing my Glock from the closet. My heart pounded uncontrollably as I gripped it tightly in my hands. The footsteps approached, this time much quieter, as if whoever was there was trying not to make a sound. I heard the creak of the stairs, the same sound we made when moving carefully. The noise echoed through the stillness of the night, intensifying my fear. I pressed my back against the wall, hiding behind the dresser with the gun pointed at the door. My heart raced, the sound of each beat feeling louder and more insistent. The door to my room was the closest to the stairs, and my mind told me anyone coming up would head straight for me. The doorknob turned slowly as if testing the resistance, and the door creaked open softly. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't see the figure, just the shadow moving, slow and threatening. I flicked on the lamp beside the bed, illuminating the scene. I screamed for the figure to stop and ordered him to lie on the floor. He raised his hands slowly, as if trying to show he wasn't a threat. But in his hands there was a small blade. His voice was calm, almost soothing. "I'm leaving," he said. Then he turned and disappeared down the stairs. I yelled, begging him to stop, but it was too late. When I rushed downstairs, the living room window was shattered, glass shards scattered across the floor. I couldn't look away from the broken window. I felt completely exposed. Even after calling the police, I kept my gun close, unable to sleep. My home's safety had been breached, and the fear of him returning wouldn't leave me alone. It was a cold, quiet night, typical of those lonely nights deep in the forest. Everything seemed calm. The sound of birds had ceased, and the wind whispered gently through the trees. I was there, alone in a cabin far from everything, surrounded only by darkness. There was something strange in the air, a sense that I wasn't completely alone. That's when I heard the whisper. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it quickly became clear it wasn't. The sound seemed to come from inside the house, as though it were emanating directly from the shadows. I looked around, but the only light was the faint glow of the candle on the table. The silence deepened with each passing second until the whisper became audible, a soft, almost inaudible voice, as if it existed in some in-between state. The whisper seemed to call to me, inviting me to follow. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, and that made me uncomfortable. My breathing grew heavier, my ears strained to catch any sound. I moved toward the door, trying to hear better, but the whisper seemed to move away as I approached. The atmosphere around me felt darker than ever. Shadows seemed alive, shifting as if they had minds of their own. The whisper persisted, growing fainter and more distant. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I shut the door and locked it, but the whisper continued. Now it seemed to come from the direction of the windows, as though trying to enter in some way. My heart raced, panic setting in. I couldn't ignore the presence anymore. The candle trembled on the table, casting shifting shadows throughout the room. The whisper became clearer, almost like it was forming incomprehensible words. I tried to scream, but my voice barely emerged. The only sound was my labored breathing. Finally, I ran to the window and looked outside. There was nothing, just the dark expanse of the forest. The whisper was gone, but the fear lingered, embedded in every part of me. The silence was no longer soothing but unsettling, as if something unseen was still waiting for me. I knew I wasn't alone, and that silence now whispered secrets I didn't want to hear. It was a cold night, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds. Everything was silent except for the faint sound of the wind passing through the trees. I was alone on a path that seemed endless, surrounded only by darkness. A few scattered rays of light managed to filter through the canopy above, casting dancing shadows on the ground. I began to feel a presence, something I couldn't explain. The shadows around me seemed to move as if they were watching me. Each step I took stretched the shadows further, as if they were closing in. I stopped, trying to listen, but the silence was absolute. I told myself it was just my imagination, trees and wind playing tricks on me. But something deep within told me otherwise. The environment felt strange, like time and space were bending. Each step made the feeling of being followed stronger. Suddenly, the shadows began forming more distinct shapes. I could swear they were moving toward me. They seemed to take on lives of their own, as if beings lurking in the darkness. The shadows of the bushes and trees morphed into human-like silhouettes, drifting in the void of night. My fear grew as I looked around, searching for something real. But all I saw were shadows, growing darker and more unsettling. I tried to run, but each movement intensified the silence around me. The trees whispered words I couldn't understand, and the only sound was the crunch of dry leaves beneath my feet. I glanced behind, and the shadows were closer than ever. They followed as if waiting for me, each step an invitation into the void. The air grew thicker, panic taking hold. I struggled to find a way out. But the shadows remained, ever present, ever watchful. They whispered secrets I couldn't hear, but I felt in every part of my body. Something told me I shouldn't be there, that the darkness held far more than just fear. No matter how hard I tried to escape, the shadows didn't disappear. They stayed with me, always lurking, reminding me that darkness hides far more than we realize. In that moment, I knew my only choice was to face the unknown. The shadows whispered to me, and I couldn't run from them. Since I was a child, my life has been surrounded by fishing stories. My family has a deep-rooted tradition with rivers and fishing, something far beyond a mere pastime. My dad, John, and my uncle Matthew were the leaders of these fishing expeditions. They always took me along, teaching me about the secrets of the water and what it meant to be part of that family. The house I grew up in was uniquely decorated, filled with reminders of boats, nets, and countless fishing tales. It was as if they didn't spend more time on land. It was the water, the river, and the sea. From a very young age, I heard stories about the sacred territory for fishing, a remote location few knew, hidden in a secluded bay. It was a place where only the most experienced dared venture. My dad, being the eldest and most responsible, would always tell these stories with a serious tone, as if he became a different person recalling those moments. He never liked to talk about what happened that night, but now and then, during family gatherings or special occasions, someone would inevitably ask him to recount it. That dark night, with its eerie silence and the fog that seemed to engulf everything, felt like a journey into another world. My dad always repeated the same phrase: "Trust your instincts if something feels off." And on that night, I knew things had gone completely off track. It was a clear day, but there was a strange heaviness in the air when it all started. I remember my dad, John, my uncle Matthew, and their friends Rich and Jeff were excited about exploring the place. It was as if they had been planning this for months, as if only that day could bring the perfect fish, the perfect story. They left the house before the sun even rose, with the boat gliding smoothly over the calm morning waters. I always saw them as experienced masters of fishing. The group was united and confident, and nothing seemed capable of disrupting their journey. The bay was only known to them, a place far from marinas and common fishing areas. They knew there were plenty of bass there and occasionally pikes. It was almost a mystical territory to them. Even with the daylight approaching, something about the moment felt off. Monty, who was always the most laid back and relaxed, opened a beer early, as if he didn't care about the weather or what lay ahead. My dad and Uncle Matthew, the most cautious of the group, never said a word. They had been through tough situations before and trusted each other. The trip was going as usual. Laughter, conversation, and the sound of the boat's engine cutting through the water. But something felt out of sync. The fog began to rise from the water, much denser than usual. My dad would never forget how everything seemed to close in around them, as if they were being swallowed by the darkness of the mist. Rich, the most experienced, became concerned and began pointing out that it was unnatural. But Jeff, the class clown, was too drunk to care. Monty, completely disconnected from the situation, laughed as if it were a big joke. At that moment, everything felt uncertain. They considered trying to leave, but the fog seemed impenetrable. The idea of spending the night on the boat started to form in their minds as an inevitable solution. But my dad knew they couldn't wait until morning. Something wasn't right, and he needed to seek help, signal for rescue. That's when the real strangeness began. After hours trapped in the thick fog, everything seemed lost. Vision was completely obscured and silence was deafening. My dad, always the calm and rational one, insisted on trying something, anything to escape the situation. But all we could see was the dense mist. Then my Uncle Matthew noticed something strange. He was looking ahead when suddenly he pointed. I turned and saw what appeared to be an indistinct shadow, something unnatural. At first, we all thought it was just another mirage caused by the fog. But as we got closer, the form became clearer. It was a figure, human, or something that looked human. It stood there, motionless in the mist, as if waiting for us. It didn't move, make any sound. It didn't seem real, but there it was. My dad ordered the engine to be cut. We stayed there, floating silently in the face of that ghostly sight. The figure seemed to materialize from nowhere. We couldn't see its face, but there was something deeply unsettling about its presence, something that made my stomach churn. Silence filled the air, except for the faint breeze and the sound of the waves. My Uncle Rich, who usually wasn't prone to fear, looked uneasy. His expression changed and he couldn't stop staring at the figure. Jeff, still drunk, laughed nervously, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. Monty, who had been completely oblivious, finally realized something was wrong, but he seemed more curious than scared. It was my dad who broke the silence. He whispered something about us needing to move away, but we couldn't tear our eyes away from that inexplicable presence. It felt like something was drawing us to it. The figure seemed to be a reflection of the fog, but at the same time, it was tangible. That sight disturbed us in ways words couldn't describe. My dad, with a trembling voice, insisted we turn the boat slowly, but the engine refused to start. All we could do was watch. Whatever it was there, watching us, waiting. And the fear we felt in that moment wasn't something we could control. It was as if we had entered a world where logic and understanding had vanished. After seeing that mysterious figure, silence between us was crushing. None of us seemed capable of speaking. We were all frozen, trying to process what we had just witnessed. The boat's engine continued off, but there was no sound beyond the whispering wind and the rhythmic waves. I stared at the faces of my companions. They were all motionless, as if frozen in time. The fog that surrounded us seemed to have thickened, making everything more oppressive. The presence of the figure seemed to amplify the silence. It was as if we were being consumed by an immense void where even our breath couldn't be heard. My hands trembled on the boat's railing. The fear felt like a constant wave growing stronger. I couldn't stop looking at the figure in the fog. Its silhouette remained as if part of the mist itself, yet real. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. My dad tried to maintain his composure, but his expression was tense. He ran his hand through his beard, murmuring things I couldn't understand. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but my voice failed before I could speak. The fog was so thick that I felt completely trapped, unable to see beyond that cold white wall. My Uncle Rich, usually the most laid back, now seemed uneasy, almost restless. He didn't say anything, but his body language said everything. Something was terribly wrong. Jeff, still in shock, was too tense to laugh, and even Monty, who normally brushed everything off, now had wide eyes searching for answers in an empty void. There was no conversation, just the sound of our breathing and the emptiness around us. We tried to communicate without words, but the only response was the echo of our own doubt. The fear was now almost tangible. Everything around us felt heavy, as if the fog had swallowed the sound, the air, and any hope of escape. At that moment, silence wasn't relief. It became a constant reminder that something incomprehensible was unfolding, and I knew I couldn't ignore that void for much longer. Something deep inside me screamed, while my mind struggled to distinguish what was real from what wasn't. The only certainty I had was the silence, endless and oppressive. After what felt like an eternity, I began to notice that the figure in the fog was no longer distant. It had moved slowly towards us. With every step it took, my chest tightened. Panic surged through me like a cold wave. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that the fog was playing tricks on me, but there was no denying what I saw. The silhouette became clearer with each passing moment. It wasn't an illusion. It was real. A dark figure, cloaked in shadows, but with details I couldn't make out. It wasn't human. It didn't seem natural. My breathing became more rapid, and the sense of suffocation intensified. The silence was deafening now, filled only by the sound of waves and my own frantic heartbeat. The figure moved with a slow, disturbing grace, almost as if it were floating, without urgency, without fear. I tried to back away, but my legs refused to move. They felt heavy, weighted down. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice was gone, blocked by the presence of whatever this was. My hands trembled, my whole body seized by fear. I turned to look at my companions, but they seemed equally frozen. None of them spoke, their expressions locked in shock. It was as if time had stopped for all of us. The figure was now only a few meters away. The presence was impossible to ignore, an oppressive energy that seemed to seep into everything around us. It wasn't just the sight. It was a primal instinct telling me this was something not normal. Something ancient, something profoundly disturbing. My heart raced even faster as the figure continued to approach with that slow, deliberate pace. All I wanted was to get away, to escape. But the fear and the sense of helplessness kept me rooted, unable to move. Each passing second felt like an eternity. I knew something was about to change, something that wouldn't ever be the same. But what terrified me the most was the feeling that with each second, that presence became more real, more solid, and perhaps it was already too late to escape. I've been fishing as long as I can remember. I'm nearly 60 now, and even after thousands of hours on the lake, I can't imagine my life without it. Fishing brings me peace, and it's the only thing that truly connects me to nature. My children are all living their own lives now, and the house is quiet. Sometimes I miss the old days when they were by my side, casting lines and laughing in the backyard. But over the years, some things just aren't part of the plan anymore. Most of the time I fish with college friends, but sometimes I prefer to go alone. There's something about being alone in nature's silence that calms me. I don't venture far from upstate New York. We have some of the best fishing lakes in the country, and I wanted to explore as many as I could before it was too late. It was mid-April, the start of the season. The ice had melted, but summer hadn't yet arrived. For some reason, I decided to seek out a more remote spot, away from the busy fishing circuits. I chose a small lake deep in the middle of nowhere. It was an hour drive from home, made before sunrise, eager to get on the water as the day began to break. I launched my kayak from the top of my car and paddled out onto the lake. I stayed in the middle, watching the first light of dawn paint the sky. It was a view I'd never trade for anything. The morning chill was still there, but my body had long grown used to it. I knew the sun would soon rise, so I got ready. I planned to fish for largemouth bass, so I picked a medium-action 6.5-foot rod with 9-pound monofilament line. I used a 4-inch rubber worm, the preferred bait for catching these fish. I was set for a peaceful, uneventful day like any other, but something made me hesitate. Something on the other side of the lake caught my attention. Initially, I thought it was another fisherman, but when I grabbed my binoculars, what I saw left me frozen. 3 figures, dressed in dark clothing with hoods covering their faces, were digging something near the lake's edge. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked strange. Too strange. The 3 figures continued their digging, and I watched, unsure of what to expect. My curiosity grew with each passing second. I tried to understand what they were doing, but something told me it wasn't anything normal. They eventually finished digging the hole, and instead of placing something inside, they began pulling something out. My confusion turned to a chill down my spine. Combined with mounting fear, my heart pounded uncontrollably. I couldn't see exactly what they were pulling out, but the way they handled the objects made me even more uneasy. The silence around me seemed to amplify every movement. After several minutes, they began tossing the objects into the lake, one after another. Each splash echoed within me. That's when the wave of fear fully overtook me. I didn't know who these people were, but I started to feel they could be dangerous. The things they were doing made no sense. I tried to move away slowly, staying as discreet as possible. Luckily, they didn't notice me. I waited until they disappeared into the forest before approaching the area where they had dug. My hands trembled as I searched for something they had thrown into the water. I didn't know what I might find, but I knew I wasn't looking for fish anymore. It was something else entirely. After calming down a bit, I went back to fishing, but it wasn't with the same enthusiasm. Everything felt different now. The anxiety from what I'd witnessed refused to leave me. I cast my line without much hope of catching anything normal. It was as if that morning had changed everything. About an hour passed and I hadn't had any luck. I tried to ignore the thoughts haunting me, but they kept creeping back. That's when I remembered the depth finder stored in my car. A flicker of determination sparked in my mind. I needed to know what was happening beneath the surface. I returned to the car, sweating cold. Retrieving the equipment felt almost impossible, but something deep inside told me I had to know what lay at the bottom of the lake. I went back to the spot where they had dug, holding the depth finder tightly. The feel of the lake's floor shifting beneath my fingers made me tremble even more. I pushed the finder forward slowly, sensing the contrast between the soft ground and something much harder. That made me stop. My breathing became shallow, as if something heavy was pressing on my chest. Carefully, I marked the spot in my mind. I returned to the shore and swapped my fishing gear for the largest hook I had. My hands were sweating as I cast the line with caution. Years of experience told me to be patient. Then the line began pulling with force. With my heart racing, I knew I had hooked something, but I wasn't prepared for what came up. When I reeled it in carefully, I couldn't hide the shiver that ran through me. A black 9mm pistol emerged from the water. My stomach turned. The gun was down there, hidden beneath the lake, as if someone had wanted to keep it buried forever. A chill ran up my spine. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't feel safe anymore. I carefully wrapped the gun in my kayak and got out of there as fast as I could. My heart pounded as I wondered who had done this and why. When I got back to land, my words barely came out. I called the police immediately. I needed them to investigate what I had found. Anxiety consumed every minute of the wait. The images of what I had seen were still fresh, haunting my mind. The police began a thorough search of the lake. I wanted to be there to see it all, as if that was the only way to find answers. No matter what they discovered, I just needed to rid myself of the lingering anxiety. They recovered several items from the lake: old keys, foreign coins, and the most unsettling, a waterproof locket. The faded photos inside were blurred and indistinguishable. When the police showed it to me, my heart tightened. The locket seemed to carry a story we'd never fully understand. The fear only grew. What were those people hiding at the bottom of the lake? Why had they thrown those things in and then returned to dig them up? I became obsessed with these questions, but the police had no answers. They told me they might contact me if they found anything, but they never did. The silence after that left me restless. Was there something they weren't telling me? Something they didn't want to know? The nights were filled with doubts and whispers of a dark past I couldn't unravel. It all felt like an endless nightmare. After that day, the peace that had once filled my home was replaced by a constant unease. Tension seemed to seep into every corner of my mind. I never knew if it was really over, or if something worse was still lurking. Days passed, but the strange sensation of being watched wouldn't go away. I avoided leaving the house at night. The silence of midnight was broken only by the wind tapping against the windows and, on some nights, footsteps that seemed to echo through the yard. One night, after weeks of torment, I heard someone whispering in the front yard. The voice was faint, and the words were lost in the air. But what froze me was hearing clearly. "It's the car, I know." It was as if someone recognized every detail of my house without permission. I stood motionless, listening as the footsteps faded. I never saw anyone. No knocks on the door or ringing of the bell, but I heard people moving around, watching. That was the last drop of fear for me. I knew something was wrong, something I couldn't comprehend, something always lurking, always watching. I kept reporting to the police, hoping they'd investigate again, but the answers I sought never came. To this day, I wonder if I'm still being watched or if it was all just in my imagination. The silence still screams in my mind, and the truth about that lake and those eerie items seems buried somewhere, along with the faded locket. All that remains are questions and the fear of never knowing the answers. I've always loved fishing. Ever since I was a kid, I'd spend hours by the lake at Shore House, a family retreat we've had for generations. It's about an hour's drive from the city, surrounded by a peaceful lagoon. My grandfather used to take my dad and uncles there, and they passed that tradition down to me. In the summer, Shore House was a paradise. We'd fish during the day, swim, play soccer, and cook fresh fish on the porch stove. It was the perfect escape from city noise and daily responsibilities. But everything changes in the fall. The bass, which were abundant in the summer, migrate, and fishing becomes much more challenging. Still, I always wanted to return in the fall with my friends to give it a shot. One day, Kevin, a friend who loved fishing as much as I did, suggested we make a trip to Shore House in late October after the summer heat had passed. He was experienced and eager to catch some bass even in the colder season. However, our situation wasn't perfect. The boat we usually used was out of the water for maintenance, so we had no way to fish from the lake. We decided that fishing from the shore would be the backup plan, even if it meant extra effort. In the end, I agreed since Kevin had the rods and the necessary gear. We gathered our group and left on a Friday afternoon, ready to try our luck at sea. Arriving at Shore House, the scene was exactly as I remembered. The tranquil lagoon reflected the moonlight, and the silence was eerily peaceful. Even with the cooler air, the sense of nostalgia was strong. We set up our camps on the sandy beach, with beach chairs and a cooler full of beer, while the fishing rod stood planted in the sand, waiting for the ocean to bring us luck that night. The sound of the sea, the cold breeze, and the surrounding darkness created an isolated atmosphere from the world. In that moment, all we wanted was to relax and fish, but what we experienced that night still haunts me to this day. After a few hours, we began to relax and enjoy the peace of the deserted beach. The night was calm, and the sound of the sea filled the silence. Kevin and Arian chatted excitedly about fishing and the luck we'd had catching some decent fish. A portable speaker played softly in the background, creating a light and laid-back atmosphere. I was lost in the view of the horizon, trying to soak in every moment, but a strange feeling started to creep over me. That's when Aaron suddenly stopped talking and turned off the music. He looked around, appearing uncomfortable, and whispered, "Did you guys hear that too?" I was confused, trying to understand what he meant. He focused on something and repeated, "Did you hear someone yell like a yo or a hey?" We all fell silent, trying to process what he was saying. We were on a deserted beach in the middle of the night, far from any sign of human life. We thought maybe he was joking or imagining things, but Aaron seemed genuinely disturbed. I turned my attention back to the sea, trying to ignore the growing unease, but the atmosphere had already changed. Soon, as I cast another line, I noticed something in the distance. I couldn't quite make out what it was, but it seemed like a human figure walking toward us across the sand. I glanced at my friends and saw they had noticed it too. My heart started to race. It didn't look like anyone we knew. The figure walked toward us with slow, hesitant steps, making everything even stranger and more uncomfortable. No one said a word. We turned off the music and fell silent, observing the stranger without moving. The figure grew closer, and the silence only heightened the tension. It came closer with a pale, silent figure, wearing a dark blue jacket and a hood that obscured part of its face. It seemed lost in some kind of reflection, but its presence was oppressively unsettling. When the figure finally approached, it looked directly at us, as if we were under its scrutiny. In a low voice, it asked, "What are you boys doing out here?" The menacing look in those eyes still haunts me. In that moment, we felt completely alone, but at the same time, intensely watched by something we couldn't understand. We all stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Kevin tried to break the silence, mumbling, "We're fishing." But the man didn't respond. He just continued to stare at us silently as if he wasn't interested in our words. We stayed there, unsure of what to do. The oppressive tension made the silence unbearable. The strange figure didn't seem bothered by the presence of 3 people on a deserted beach in the middle of the night. He glanced at the fishing rods, then at the sea, then back at us, as if trying to understand what we were doing there. He said nothing, made no gestures, just stared at us with a look that conveyed something dark and incomprehensible. Every passing second felt like an eternity. We exchanged glances, trying to figure out what was running through his mind. The heavy atmosphere and silence only amplified the feeling that we were being watched by something extremely strange. Finally, after what felt like endless seconds, the man turned and walked away without saying a word, without looking back. He disappeared into the night's darkness as if he had never been there. We stayed behind, still frozen, unsure of what to think. The only sound left was the uncomfortable silence that surrounded us. After the stranger left, we still stood there in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The music was off and the sound of the sea felt distant, as if the environment was waiting to surprise us again. For several minutes, no one spoke until I looked at the horizon, feeling an unease I couldn't explain. That's when I almost heard a whisper in the back of my mind. I recognized the sound. It took me a moment to realize what it was. My heart started to race. I knew what it was. It was the sound of my car alarm. My car was parked a few dozen meters away in the small gravel parking lot. The alarm sound was clear and loud, but almost muted thanks to the distance and the silent night. I knew there was no one for miles except for us 3. Panic quickly took hold of me. "It's my car," I whispered, barely believing what I was hearing. The alarm continued to blare, louder and more desperate. Kevin looked at me, his eyes wide. "You're kidding, right?" His voice trembled. Arian turned and strained to listen. "Is it your car?" He sounded just as frightened as us. I nodded, unable to find any words that could explain what was happening. The alarm persisted, breaking the silence of the night like an echoing whisper. I knew we were alone, miles away from anyone, but the sound kept going as if someone was still there, watching, waiting. The air grew heavy, as if a shadow had fallen over us. The alarm continued to echo in my head, louder and more frantic. It felt like that sound was stopping me from thinking clearly. Yet I knew I had to react. I looked around, searching for answers, but all I saw was the empty sea and the darkness surrounding us. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice louder than I intended. Panic was evident in all of us. Kevin shook his head, seeming dazed. "There's no one here, man. No one." But the alarm didn't stop. I began walking toward my car, my steps sounding loud and urgent on the silent sand. Kevin and Arian followed me, hesitantly but aware that something was seriously wrong. Each step dragged the fear that had now consumed us. When we reached the parking lot, the alarm was still blaring, deafening and desperate. I looked at my car and saw the tires slashed, the driver's side window shattered. My chest tightened. "This doesn't make sense," Kevin murmured, his voice trembling with fear. That's when something moved in the trees in the distance. My heart nearly leapt from my chest. A figure, someone, was approaching slowly from the shadows. My breath hitched. The figure was alone, silent, and made no sound as it walked toward us. The silence around us was oppressive. I could hear the whispering of the wind through the leaves, the soft crunch of sand beneath our feet. But that man kept walking toward us with a vacant, menacing gaze. "Run!" I screamed, my eyes locked on the figure. Without thinking, we ran, as fast as we could, leaving everything behind: the chairs, the coolers, the fishing rods. The alarm faded into the distance, but the real threat was coming toward us. We ran for miles, each step echoing on the empty road. My legs felt like they were failing, but the fear kept us moving. I knew if we stopped, he would be there, waiting. And we couldn't let that happen.